a single cell phone signal pinging a tower, a camper van parked in the shadows, and a 30-minute phone conversation held by a stranger just moments before the alarm was raised. For 15 years, the world has debated theories and pointed fingers at the family, but the real answer may have been hiding in plain sight, living just miles down the road from the Ocean Club. Today, we are analyzing the German suspect, the timeline that exposed him, and the forensic mistakes that allowed a predator to slip away into the night. If you value deep investigative reports, please press the like button and subscribe to our channel right now. It helps us bring these forgotten files back into the light. Now, let us return to the night of May 3rd. On the evening of May 3rd, 2007, the coastal town of Praia da Luz in the Algarve region of Portugal presented a picture of perfect tranquility. It was the kind of evening that holiday brochures promise but rarely deliver. Mild temperatures, a gentle Atlantic breeze, and the quiet hum of families winding down after a day in the sun. For one British family, this was the penultimate night of their spring break. They were staying at the Ocean Club, a sprawling resort complex that was popular with tourists from the United Kingdom. To the casual observer, the resort appeared to be a secure bubble, a whitewashed sanctuary of leisure separated from the outside world. However, analysts looking back at this location argue that this sense of security was largely illusory. The complex was not a gated community in the strict sense. Public roads intersected the accommodation blocks, and access to the apartments was relatively unrestricted for anyone walking from the street. The family in question was part of a larger traveling group that the media would later dub the Tapas 7. This group consisted of several professional couples, mostly doctors and medical experts, who had traveled together for a week of relaxation. Their routine had become established over the preceding days. The adults would dine at the resort's tapas restaurant, situated near the swimming pool, while their sleeping family members remained in the nearby apartments. On this specific night, the group convened at the restaurant around 8:30 in the evening. The distance between the dining table and the apartment where the family slept was roughly nearly 100 yards, or perhaps slightly less, depending on the walking route taken. It was a distance that felt manageable, a proximity that suggested safety. From an investigative standpoint, the logistics of that dinner are critical to understanding the timeline of the disappearance. The parents had declined the use of the resort's evening creche services or baby listening patrols. Instead, they opted for a system that many in the group felt was responsible enough. They would take turns leaving the dinner table to physically check on the sleeping individuals in the apartments. This listening service, as they called it, involved walking back to the rooms every 20 to 30 minutes to ensure silence and safety. Critics and security experts have since debated the wisdom of this decision extensively. In the cultural context of the time, and within the perceived safety of a family-friendly resort, leaving sleeping family members in an unlocked apartment while dining nearby was not entirely uncommon. However, retrospect tells a harsher story. The apartment, Unit 5A, was situated on the ground floor. It was a corner unit, bordered by a public street and a car park. This specific location made it arguably the most vulnerable unit in the block. It offered 2 points of entry: the front door, which faced the car park and was locked, and the rear patio doors, which led to the pool area and were left unlocked by the parents to allow them to enter quietly during their checks without waking the sleepers. One of the most significant aspects of this case is the psychological state of the parents and the group. There is a phenomenon known as the holiday mindset, where individuals lower their natural defenses because the environment feels curated and protected. The Ocean Club felt like a village where everyone knew everyone, but in reality, it was an open environment. The unlocked patio door is the pivot point of the entire mystery. The father later stated that they left it unlocked solely for ease of access during checks. They did not anticipate that an intruder would act with such boldness in a semi-public area. At roughly 9 o'clock in the evening, the father stood up from the dinner table to conduct his scheduled check. He walked the short distance to the apartment, entered through the unlocked patio doors, and observed the room. According to his testimony, the situation appeared normal. The eldest daughter and her two younger siblings were asleep. However, he did note one small anomaly. The door to the children's bedroom, which he recalled leaving slightly ajar, was now open wider than before. At the time, he attributed this to a draft or perhaps the movement of one of the sleepers. He did not enter the room fully to investigate, but saw enough to be satisfied that everyone was present. He closed the door slightly, returned to the patio, and walked back to the restaurant. This moment, the 9 o'clock check, is often cited by investigators as the sliding doors moment of the entire case. If the father had stepped further into the room, or if he had turned on a light to investigate why the door had moved, the timeline of history might have been altered. It is possible, according to some theories, that an intruder was already present in the apartment, concealed in the shadows, or that the individual had just left. The father's dismissal of the open door as a trivial detail highlights how the human brain rationalizes irregularities when it does not expect danger. He returned to the group, unaware that this was likely the last time a family member would be in close proximity to the eldest daughter while she was still safely inside the apartment. Between 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock, the window of opportunity for any potential perpetrator was wide open. The group continued their dinner, laughing and conversing, secure in the knowledge that the father had just seen everyone asleep. Another member of the group went to check on his own family at roughly 9:30. He offered to check on the apartment in question as well, but he did not enter Unit 5A. Instead, he listened at the door, and hearing no noise, assumed all was well. This creates a terrifying silence in the timeline. For nearly 1 hour, from the father's check until the mother's discovery, the apartment was effectively unmonitored, aside from a brief listen at the door. During this hour, the street outside was quiet but not deserted. Reports gathered later would indicate that tourists were walking by and vehicles were moving on the perimeter roads. The juxtaposition of the lively dinner at the tapas bar and the silent, vulnerable ground floor apartment creates a haunting narrative contrast. The apartment was dark, accessible, and occupied by 3 defenseless sleeping subjects. The shutters on the window were made of metal and could be raised from the outside if one knew how, or if they had not been latched correctly from the inside. As the hour approached 10 o'clock, the mother prepared to make her check. The atmosphere at the table was still light. There was no premonition of the catastrophe that was about to unfold. The narrative of this case is compelling because it rests on the edge of normalcy. It challenges every parent or guardian who has ever trusted a quiet environment. The events that were about to be discovered would launch the most extensive missing person search in modern history. But at this specific moment, in the cool air of a Portuguese spring night, the mystery was just beginning to take shape in the darkness of apartment 5A. The silence was absolute, but it was a deceptive silence. The tragedy had likely already occurred, hidden behind the white walls and the closed curtains, while the world outside continued to dine. In the annals of modern criminal investigations, few timeframes have been scrutinized as intensely as the 60 minutes between 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock on the evening of May 3rd, 2007. This specific hour is frequently referred to by investigators as the window of silence. It represents the period during which the eldest daughter of the British family vanished from apartment 5A. From a forensic perspective, this hour is the black box of the case. While the parents and their colleagues were dining less than 100 yards away, events were unfolding inside the apartment that would spark a global search operation lasting nearly 2 decades. To understand how a disappearance of this magnitude could occur within such a short proximity to the guardians, one must analyze the sequence of checks performed by the dining group. The parents had established a roster system, taking turns to leave the table and visually verify the safety of the sleeping individuals. This system relied heavily on the assumption that the environment was benign. Security analysts reviewing the case note that this routine created a predictable pattern of movement, one that could potentially have been observed by a watcher stationed in the shadows of the resort complex. The first critical juncture in this timeline occurred at roughly 9 o'clock in the evening. The father left the tapas restaurant to conduct his scheduled check. According to his subsequent statements to the authorities, he entered the apartment using the rear patio doors, which had been left unlocked for access. He observed the 3 family members sleeping soundly. However, he noted a detail that would later become significant. The door to the bedroom was open wider than he recalled leaving it. At that specific moment, the father attributed this change in the door's position to a draft, or perhaps a natural shift caused by the movement of air within the apartment. He did not perform a thorough search of the room, nor did he check the wardrobes or the bathroom. He visually confirmed the presence of the eldest daughter and the younger siblings, then returned the door to its previous position and left the apartment. In hindsight, investigative psychologists often point to this as a classic example of normalcy bias. The human brain is wired to interpret ambiguous signals as normal rather than threatening. Had the father investigated the cause of the door's movement, he might have encountered an intruder or discovered that the window was already tampered with. This moment is often cited as the missed opportunity that could have prevented the subsequent tragedy. Approximately 30 minutes later, around 9:30 in the evening, another member of the dining group left the table to check on his own family members. As a courtesy, he offered to check on the apartment of the British family as well. This check is highly controversial in the reconstruction of the timeline. The individual did not enter the bedroom. Instead, he listened at the door and, hearing no distress or noise, assumed that the silence equated to safety. This distinction between a visual check and an auditory check is crucial. By relying on silence as a confirmation of presence, the timeline effectively extended the window of opportunity for any potential perpetrator. If the eldest daughter had already been removed from the apartment by 9:30, the silence heard by the colleague was the silence of an empty room. Conversely, if the perpetrator was in the process of the act, the lack of entry by the colleague allowed the event to continue uninterrupted. This period of the evening is defined by near misses and assumptions that proved catastrophic. The timeline abruptly terminated at 10 o'clock in the evening. It was the mother's turn to conduct the check. Upon entering the apartment through the patio doors, she reportedly noticed an immediate change in the atmosphere of the room. The door to the bedroom, which the father had adjusted earlier, was slammed open or standing wide open. More alarmingly, the window in the bedroom was open, and the external metal shutters were raised. The mother's initial reaction was one of confusion rather than panic. She looked at the bed where the eldest daughter should have been sleeping and found it empty. The soft toy belonging to the daughter was still present, but the individual was gone. The realization that the disappearance was not a case of wandering off, but rather an external removal, crystallized when she observed the open window. The draft blowing through the room confirmed that the security of the apartment had been breached. The reaction that followed the discovery marked the end of the window of silence and the beginning of the window of chaos. The mother ran back to the tapas restaurant, alerting the table with the statement that the daughter had been taken. This declaration is significant because it suggests an immediate intuitive understanding that a crime had occurred, rather than a simple case of a lost family member. From a procedural standpoint, the events immediately following 10 o'clock were damaging to the potential forensic evidence. The group of friends, along with resort staff and other guests, immediately began searching the premises. While this reaction was driven by a natural human instinct to help, it likely contaminated the crime scene. Footprints, fingerprints, and DNA evidence that might have been present near the window or the patio doors were at risk of being trampled by the frantic search party. Reviewing this chapter of the event, experts emphasize the fragility of the timeline. The entire disappearance hinged on small decisions. The decision to leave a door unlocked, the decision not to turn on a light, and the decision to listen rather than look. The perpetrator, whether opportunistic or planned, operated within the gaps left by these decisions. Furthermore, the layout of the apartment contributed to the ease of the event. The street-facing window offered a potential exit route that led away from the pool area where the parents were dining. If the perpetrator exited through the window, they would have stepped directly onto a public street, vanishing into the darkness of Praia da Luz within seconds. The window of silence effectively provided a cloak of invisibility, allowing the subject to be removed from the immediate vicinity before the alarm was even raised. The subsequent investigation would struggle for years to fill in the blanks of this specific hour, trying to determine who was watching the watchers. The precise moment the alarm was raised marks the definitive transition from a leisure event to a criminal inquiry. Following the mother's discovery at approximately 10 o'clock in the evening, the immediate reaction was one of acute distress. Witnesses at the scene later recounted the mother returning to the dining table in a state of high agitation, declaring that the eldest daughter had been taken. This specific phrasing is significant to behavioral analysts. It indicates that the family immediately perceived the absence, not as a wandering event, but as an external act of removal. This conviction set the tone for the chaotic minutes that followed, shifting the group's dynamic from social relaxation to emergency response. The psychological impact of this moment cannot be overstated. In emergency management theory, this is known as the shock phase, where cognitive processing is often overtaken by panic. The group left the table instantly, abandoning their meal to rush toward apartment 5A. This rapid mobilization, while understandable from a human perspective, would later become a point of contention regarding the preservation of the location. The distinction between a crime scene and a search area was immediately blurred. Within minutes of the alarm being raised, the search effort expanded beyond the immediate family circle. The resort staff and other guests staying at the complex joined the effort, creating a large, uncoordinated search party. Reports indicate that dozens of individuals began combing the resort grounds, the swimming pool area, and the surrounding streets, calling out the name of the missing individual. From a tactical perspective, this mass mobilization had two opposing effects. On one hand, it provided immediate manpower to cover ground, which is critical if a subject has simply wandered off and is nearby. On the other hand, the influx of untrained searchers into the primary zone created a chaotic environment. Without a central command to direct these efforts, the search was haphazard. Critical exit routes may have been ignored while people congregated in areas that had already been checked. This period of well-intentioned disorder is often where crucial initial clues are overlooked or inadvertently destroyed by the volume of foot traffic. The timeline regarding the involvement of law enforcement reveals a significant lag that experts argue was detrimental to the investigation. While the search by staff and guests began almost immediately, the arrival of the local police force was not instantaneous. Upon their arrival, the initial assessment by the Portuguese authorities was that the missing individual had likely wandered away from the apartment, rather than being the subject of a criminal extraction. This assumption that the disappearance was accidental rather than criminal dictated the early tempo of the police work. Resources were initially directed toward a physical search of the local terrain rather than the immediate implementation of a criminal blockade. It was only as the hours passed without a sighting that the hypothesis shifted toward abduction. This delay in reclassifying the event meant that the rigorous protocols required for a major crime scene were not applied during the most vital early stages. One of the most severely criticized aspects of the initial response was the failure to secure apartment 5A in a standard criminal investigation. The location where a person was last seen is treated as a sterile zone. Access is strictly prohibited to preserve forensic evidence such as fibers, fingerprints, and biological material. However, in the chaos of that night, the apartment was accessed by multiple individuals, including family members, friends, resort staff, and police officers who were not wearing protective forensic clothing. The Portuguese police later admitted that the crime scene had not been adequately preserved. This contamination is a critical failure point. Any potential evidence left by an intruder, such as a footprint on the floor or DNA near the window, was likely compromised by the traffic of people moving through the apartment. Analysts argue that this loss of forensic integrity made it exponentially harder to prove the presence of a stranger in the room. The golden hour. The short window after a crime where evidence is freshest was effectively spent on a contaminated search rather than a forensic lockdown. While the local search continued into the night, the broader tactical response involved alerting national infrastructures. The government eventually placed border crossings and airports on alert, circulating the description of the missing individual. However, security experts emphasize that for such an alert to be effective, it must be triggered immediately. The geographical position of Praia da Luz is relevant here. It is a short drive to the Spanish border and close to several maritime exit points. If a perpetrator had access to a vehicle, they could have moved the subject out of the immediate jurisdiction before the roadblocks were fully established. The delay in communicating with migration authorities and border control is a recurring critique in the review of the case files. The investigation was fighting a battle against time, and in those initial hours, time was moving faster than the bureaucratic machinery of the response. By the time the sun rose on the morning of May 4th, the reality of the situation had set in. The resort was no longer a holiday destination, but the epicenter of a major criminal investigation. The local police, despite their initial hesitation, were now fully engaged, and the parents were thrust into a nightmare that was being broadcast to the world. The transition from the vanishing to the alarm was complete. But the flaws in that transition, the contaminated scene, the delayed border alerts, and the initial misinterpretation of the event had already laid the groundwork for a mystery that would baffle the world for decades. The alarm had been sounded, but many argue it rang out into the night just a fraction too late to stop the perpetrator from slipping away into the shadows. In the specialized field of criminal investigation, specifically cases involving the non-voluntary removal of individuals, there exists a critical concept known as the golden hour. This term refers to the immediate period following the report of an incident, a fleeting window of time where evidence is fresh. Witness memories are sharp, and the perpetrator is still likely within a close geographical radius. Retrospective analysis of the Ocean Club inquiry suggests that this vital operational window was not maximized, leading to a cascade of challenges that would hamper the investigation for years to come. The initial response by the local authorities was predicated on the assumption that the missing daughter was still alive and located within the national borders of Portugal. While this hypothesis drove a spirited local search, it arguably delayed the implementation of a wider international containment strategy. Security experts reviewing the case file emphasize that in cross-border regions like the Algarve, the immediate closure of transit points is paramount. The delay in effectively sealing the borders and alerting migration authorities allowed for a potential exit route to remain viable during the most crucial phase of the timeline. Perhaps the most baffling procedural error documented in the case history concerns the treatment of the apartment itself. In modern forensics, the location where a person was last seen is considered sacred ground. It holds the microscopic keys to the identity of the intruder. However, it was later revealed that the apartment was not immediately sealed off as a sterile crime scene. Instead, the unit was rented out to 2 other families in the weeks following the disappearance, before being officially sealed for a comprehensive forensic examination. This revelation implies a catastrophic compromise of biological evidence. By allowing new occupants to live in the space, potential fingerprints, fibers, or DNA traces left by the perpetrator were likely degraded or overlaid with new material. Roughly 1 month after the disappearance, the Portuguese police formally admitted that the scene of the crime had not been adequately protected during the initial response. This admission validated the fears of many observers that the physical link to the perpetrator might have been destroyed not by malice, but by a lack of adherence to strict preservation protocols. In the absence of immediate leads, the search effort relied heavily on manpower. Hundreds of volunteers mobilized to assist the authorities, scouring the resort grounds, the beach, and the surrounding scrubland. While this outpouring of support demonstrated the solidarity of the community and the tourists, it also presented a logistical nightmare for professional investigators. A large volume of untrained individuals moving through potential evidence zones can inadvertently alter the environment. The distinction between a rescue mission and a criminal investigation was blurred. The focus was on locating the missing individual physically, which is understandable, but this focus may have come at the expense of securing the forensic narrative. The authorities were under immense pressure to show visibility and action, which resulted in a broad but scientifically uncontrolled search operation. The investigation was further complicated by the international nature of the case. While the Portuguese authorities took the lead initiative, the response involved significant coordination with agencies from the United Kingdom, specifically the Leicestershire Police, who managed the British side of the inquiry. This partnership, while necessary, introduced layers of bureaucratic friction, navigating different legal systems, language barriers, and investigative philosophies created a drag on the efficiency of the operation. Key intelligence regarding the movement of the missing individual out of the country relies on seamless communication between local police and international migration authorities. Experts argue that the immediate intervention required to stop a suspect at a border was diluted by the time taken to establish these lines of communication. As the investigation stretched from days into weeks, the optimism that characterized the early golden hour began to fade. The failure to secure the crime scene and the inability to find a verified trail led to a grim realization among the investigative teams. When the case reached the 100-day mark, the Portuguese investigators publicly acknowledged that the likelihood of finding the missing daughter alive had significantly diminished. This shift marked the end of the emergency phase. The opportunity to solve the case through rapid response had passed. The investigation would now have to rely on cold leads and circumstantial evidence, a much more difficult path. The golden hour had been lost, consumed by procedural delays and the contamination of the scene, leaving a void that speculation and theory would soon rush to fill. The question remains whether a stricter adherence to protocol in those first 24 hours could have yielded a different outcome for the missing subject. In the immediate aftermath of the disappearance, a phenomenon emerged that would come to define the case almost as much as the investigation itself: the unprecedented mobilization of the global media. The parents and various support campaigns were determined not to let the world forget the missing daughter. This strategy was deliberate and immediate. Recognizing that the local search had yielded no physical results during the critical early window, the family and their advisors pivoted toward a strategy of maximum visibility. The image of the missing individual, specifically the close-up photograph highlighting the distinct defect in the right eye, was broadcast across every major news network, printed on millions of posters, and displayed at major sporting events. Media analysts often cite this case as the first truly global missing person inquiry of the 21st century. The speed at which the story traveled from a resort in southern Portugal to the front pages of newspapers in the United Kingdom, the United States, and beyond was accelerated by the nascent power of the internet and 24-hour news cycles. The objective was clear: to make the face of the missing subject so recognizable that no perpetrator could hide her, and no witness could ignore a sighting. However, this high-visibility strategy created a complex dynamic between the family, the public, and the investigators. The decision to maintain such a high profile was driven by the hope that the daughter was still alive and could be recovered. However, this total saturation approach acted as a double-edged sword for the investigation. On one side, it generated significant funding and kept the pressure on the authorities to continue their work. On the other side, it created an overwhelming amount of noise that threatened to drown out credible intelligence. When a case becomes this prominent, the threshold for reporting a sighting drops significantly. Well-meaning individuals across the globe began to see the missing daughter in every crowd. Reports of alleged sightings flooded in from countries far removed from the crime scene, including Malta, Belgium, and Spain. There were even reports originating from outside the European continent, suggesting a vast geographic dispersal that was statistically unlikely but impossible to ignore. Each of these sightings required resources to verify, diverting police attention away from the primary timeline and the immediate forensic evidence in Portugal. From an investigative standpoint, this influx of data created a massive signal-to-noise problem. Detectives were forced to sift through thousands of well-intentioned but erroneous reports. For example, a sighting in a Belgian city might trigger a full-scale review of CCTV footage in that region, consuming valuable man-hours, only to be ruled out days later. Critics of the media strategy argue that the intense publicity may have also impacted the behavior of the perpetrator. By making the missing individual the most famous person on the planet at that time, the campaign may have inadvertently forced the abductor deeper into the shadows, making the subject too hot to handle or move. Conversely, proponents of the campaign argue that without this pressure, the case would have been archived and forgotten by the public within months, as sadly happens with many other similar disappearances. The parents maintained that until there was proof of a fatal outcome, the search for a living individual had to continue. As the weeks turned into months, the nature of the media coverage began to shift. Initially, the narrative was one of universal sympathy and support for the family. However, as the investigation stalled and no breakthrough occurred, the media gaze turned inward, scrutinizing the parents and their decisions. The narrative transformed from a simple search mission into a forensic examination of the family's lifestyle, their decision to leave the sleeping subjects unattended, and their behavior in front of the cameras. This shift was subtle at first, but became pronounced as the summer of 2007 progressed. The constant presence of cameras meant that every facial expression, every tear, and every moment of composure shown by the parents was analyzed by body language experts and commentators on cable news. The public became armchair detectives, consuming the tragedy as a form of serialized drama. This intrusion added an immense psychological burden to the family, who were grieving a loss while simultaneously managing a global public relations campaign. The financial aspect of the search also drew significant media attention. The fund established to find the missing daughter raised millions, allowing the family to hire private detectives when the official police investigation slowed down or was archived. This privatization of the investigation was rare and controversial. It highlighted the disparity between cases that garner media attention and those that do not. Ultimately, the media storm ensured that the image of the missing daughter remains one of the most recognizable in modern history. Even 15 years after the event, the case continues to generate headlines and documentaries, proving that the strategy to never let the world forget was successful in its execution. Even if the primary goal of recovery remains unfulfilled, the global gaze remains fixed on this mystery, waiting for the final piece of information that will resolve the narrative that began in the media spotlight of 2007. By late summer of 2007, roughly 4 months after the disappearance, the investigation into the vanishing at the Ocean Club underwent a seismic structural shift. The initial hypothesis that a predator had entered the apartment and removed the eldest daughter had failed to yield a suspect or a recovery. Under immense pressure from both the international media and their own government to produce results, the Portuguese authorities began to reassess the foundational premises of the case. This period is characterized by a dramatic change in the relationship between the parents and the investigators. What began as a collaborative effort to locate a missing family member deteriorated into an adversarial legal confrontation. Security analysts suggest that when a high-profile investigation stalls, detectives often circle back to the last people known to have seen the subject alive. In this instance, that procedural recoil focused entirely on the parents. The failure to find a kidnapper led the authorities to construct an alternative narrative, that there was no kidnapper at all. In September 2007, the legal status of the parents changed formally. They were declared arguidos, a specific Portuguese legal term that has no direct equivalent in the British legal system, but translates roughly to formal suspects or persons of interest. This designation allowed the police to ask more direct and incriminating questions, but it also granted the parents certain legal protections, such as the right to remain silent. The shift was shocking to the public observers who had been following the daily appeals for information. The narrative presented by the detectives was that the disappearance was not a criminal abduction by a stranger, but rather a domestic tragedy that had been covered up. The hypothesis posited by the lead investigators suggested that the daughter had died in the apartment due to an accident, and that the parents, in a state of panic, had concealed the event to protect their professional reputations and the remaining family members. This theory required a suspension of belief regarding the timeline, suggesting that the abduction was an elaborate fabrication constructed in the window of silence. The interrogation sessions that followed this designation were intense and exhaustive. The parents were separated and questioned for hours, facing allegations that they were responsible for the absence of their daughter. The police leveraged the lack of physical evidence of a break-in, such as the absence of forced entry marks on the shutters, to support their theory that the break-in was staged. However, legal experts reviewing the transcripts and the proceedings noted a significant reliance on interpretation rather than hard forensic data. The investigators were trying to fit the behavior of the parents, their composure, their timeline, their media strategy into a profile of guilt. The parents vehemently denied these accusations, maintaining that the window was open upon discovery and that the daughter had been taken. The friction between the emotional reality of the parents and the cold, theoretical logic of the police created a deadlock that dominated the headlines. Despite the gravity of the accusations and the formal change in status, the authorities faced a critical hurdle: a total lack of concrete evidence. There was no body, no weapon, and no definitive forensic proof linking the parents to a crime. The theory of concealment relied on the parents having the means and opportunity to dispose of a subject in a foreign country, while under constant surveillance by the media and the public, within an impossibly tight time frame. Critics of the police investigation argue that this pivot to the parents was a result of tunnel vision. By focusing exclusively on the family, valuable resources were diverted away from pursuing external leads or tracking potential suspects who might have left the country. The arguido status hung over the family like a cloud, damaging their reputation and complicating the search fund efforts. Yet it produced no actionable legal outcome. By the end of this phase, the investigation had effectively stalled. The police could not prove the parents were involved, nor could they prove an abduction had occurred. The relationship between the British family and the Portuguese authorities was irrevocably broken. This chapter of the saga serves as a case study in the dangers of confirmational bias in criminal investigations. When the evidence does not fit the preferred theory, the danger lies in trying to force the facts to match the narrative. Ultimately, the designation of the parents as suspects did not bring the case closer to a resolution. Instead, it added a layer of legal complexity and personal trauma to an already devastating event. As the year 2007 drew to a close, the mystery remained as impenetrable as ever, with the official investigation drifting into a state of paralysis, leaving the fate of the missing daughter entirely unknown. As the summer of 2007 progressed without a breakthrough, the investigation took a turn toward highly specialized forensic methods. In an effort to break the deadlock, the Portuguese authorities accepted assistance from the United Kingdom police, specifically a team of specialized canines. These were not ordinary tracking dogs used to follow a scent trail across a landscape. They were victim recovery dogs, trained to detect the microscopic particulates associated with human biological material and the specific chemical markers of a fatality. The deployment of these animals marked a significant pivot in the investigative strategy. The theory was no longer just about locating a missing person. It was about determining if the subject had ever left the apartment alive. The dogs, highly regarded in British policing circles for their precision, were brought to Praia da Luz to examine the apartment, the surrounding areas, and various items of property belonging to the family and the group. This phase of the inquiry would generate some of the most contentious and debated evidence in the entire case history. Upon entering apartment 5A, the reaction of the canines was immediate and distinct. Reports from the handlers indicated that the dogs alerted in specific areas of the accommodation. An alert, in this context, consists of the dog barking or holding a position to signal to the handler that it has detected the target scent. One dog, trained to detect forensic markers, reportedly signaled behind a sofa in the living area. The second dog, trained to identify specific biological evidence, allegedly alerted in the same area and near a wardrobe in the parents' bedroom. To the investigators on the ground, these alerts were interpreted as a revelation. It provided the first tangible suggestion that a fatality might have occurred within the apartment, directly contradicting the abduction theory. However, forensic experts caution against treating canine alerts as definitive proof. A dog's reaction is an intelligence tool, a signpost indicating where to look for physical evidence, rather than evidence itself. The environment of a holiday apartment is complex. It has been occupied by hundreds of previous tenants, any of whom could have left microscopic biological traces from minor injuries or mundane events unrelated to a crime. The most damaging allegation to emerge from the canine search involved a vehicle. The family had rented a passenger car several weeks after the disappearance to facilitate their movements during the campaign. When the dogs were taken to examine this vehicle, they reportedly alerted to the key fob and the interior of the boot. This specific detail became the cornerstone of the police theory against the parents. The authorities hypothesized that the biological markers detected in the car suggested the movement of the subject long after the initial disappearance. This implied a scenario where the body had been hidden and then moved weeks later. However, this theory faced a massive logical and logistical hurdle. The car was not rented until over 3 weeks after the event. For the alert to be valid, one would have to accept that the parents, while under the scrutiny of the world's media and constant police surveillance, managed to transport remains without detection. The critical failure of the forensic phase lies in the gap between the dog's alerts and the laboratory science. Material samples collected from the areas where the dogs alerted, including carpet fibers from the apartment and swabs from the car, were sent to a specialized forensic service in the United Kingdom for DNA analysis. The expectation was that science would corroborate the canine intelligence. The results, however, were inconclusive. The laboratory could not generate a full DNA profile that matched the missing daughter from the samples provided. While some markers were present, they were too degraded or too complex, mixed with multiple people's DNA, to serve as proof of identity. In a court of law, a dog's bark cannot stand alone. It must be supported by physical evidence. The absence of a confirmed DNA match meant that the alerts remained subjective interpretations rather than objective facts. The defense argued successfully that the dogs could have been reacting to transfer scent on clothing or simply cross-contamination from the parents who had been in contact with their daughter prior to the disappearance. From an analytical perspective, this chapter of the investigation demonstrates the perilous nature of confirmation bias. The investigators appeared to work backward from the dog's reactions, constructing a theory to fit the alerts, rather than letting the hard evidence lead the narrative. By elevating the status of the canine intelligence to that of hard proof, the inquiry narrowed its focus exclusively onto the family, potentially blinding detectives to other possibilities. Legal analysts have since debated the reliability of such evidence in criminal proceedings. While the dogs are undeniably skilled, they are not infallible. They can make mistakes, and they can be influenced by the subtle, unconscious cues of their handlers, a phenomenon known as the clever Hans effect. In the absence of a body or a confession, the controversial forensics served only to deepen the mystery and fracture the trust between the family and the police, without bringing the case any closer to a resolution. The science had failed to provide the smoking gun that the authorities so desperately sought. By July of 2008, 14 months after the disappearance, the investigation reached a definitive legal stalemate. The Portuguese Attorney General's office made a landmark announcement that effectively dismantled the theories pursued over the previous year. The authorities publicly stated that there was no evidence to support the involvement of the parents in the disappearance of the missing individual. Consequently, the arguido status, the formal suspect designation that had hung over the couple since the previous September, was lifted. This moment was pivotal, not just for the family, but for the trajectory of the entire case. The final report issued by the Portuguese police concluded that the inquiry had exhausted all available lines of investigation without producing a result. They admitted that they could not determine who was responsible for the crime, nor could they locate the missing subject. As a result, the case was officially archived. In legal terms, this meant the active police work was suspended pending the emergence of significant new evidence. To the public, it appeared as though the system had given up, leaving the mystery unresolved and the family in a state of indefinite limbo. The archiving of the case created a dangerous vacuum. With the state authorities stepping back, the parents were left with a stark choice: accept the lack of answers or take the investigation into their own hands. They chose the latter, utilizing the Find Madeleine Fund, a pool of public donations to employ private detectives and forensic experts. This transition marked the beginning of what analysts refer to as the wilderness years of the inquiry. However, the shift from a state-led investigation to a private one revealed significant structural limitations. Private investigators, no matter how skilled, lack the statutory powers of the police. They cannot execute search warrants, they cannot subpoena telephone records, and they cannot compel witnesses to testify. Their work relies on open-source intelligence and the voluntary cooperation of the public. This period demonstrated that money alone cannot buy the legal authority required to solve a complex international crime. The investigation fragmented into disparate leads, many of which led to dead ends, or worse, to opportunistic individuals seeking to exploit the family's desperation. Security experts reviewing this phase often highlight the extreme vulnerability of families in this position. Without the filter of official police procedure, the parents were exposed to a barrage of false information. They faced approaches from fraudsters claiming to hold key information in exchange for financial reward, and psychics offering unverifiable visions. The emotional toll of chasing these phantom leads is immense. Furthermore, the private investigations often lack the coordination of a centralized task force. Reports suggest that during these cold years, various agencies were hired and dismissed, leading to a lack of continuity in the intelligence gathering. Critical information may have been lost in the handover between different private entities, or simply not shared effectively with the official authorities who retained jurisdiction over the case file. This era serves as a cautionary tale regarding the limitations of privatized justice in the face of serious criminal activity. In May of 2011, 4 years after the event, the campaign to find the missing daughter entered a new phase with the publication of a book written by the mother. The primary objective of this publication was financial. The costs of maintaining a private investigation were exorbitant, and the public donations were dwindling. The proceeds from the book were explicitly designated to fund the continued search operations. The release of the book was also a strategic media move. It served to humanize the narrative, reclaiming the story from the tabloids and the police files. It allowed the mother to present her account of the timeline and the emotional reality of the loss directly to the public. Analysts note that this publication played a crucial role in keeping the case in the collective consciousness. In a world where news cycles move rapidly, the book ensured that the face of the missing individual remained visible, preventing the case from fading into total obscurity during the years of official inaction. For nearly 3 years, from the archiving in 2008 until the review in 2011, the case remained largely stagnant. The Portuguese authorities rejected early calls to reopen the investigation, citing a lack of credible new data. This period represents a failure of international cooperation. While the British police were observing from a distance, they had no jurisdiction to intervene on Portuguese soil. The cold years allowed the trail to go significantly cold. Witnesses moved away, memories faded, and potential physical evidence in the environment was lost to the elements. The perpetrator, whoever they were, was granted a period of relative safety, unpursued by the full weight of the law. It was a period defined by silence, a silence that was only broken by the persistence of the family who refused to accept the official administrative conclusion that the case was closed. It would take a shift in political will and a review by Scotland Yard to eventually reignite the machinery of justice. By the year 2011, The investigation into the disappearance at the Ocean Club had been dormant in Portugal for nearly 3 years. The official archiving of the case in 2008 had left a procedural void, filled only by the private investigators hired by the family. However, the persistence of the parents and a high-profile campaign eventually reached the highest levels of the British government. In a move that legal analysts describe as unprecedented for a single missing person case, the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary authorized a metropolitan police review of the entire inquiry. This initiative was designated Operation Grange. It was not merely a continuation of previous efforts, but a zero-based review. This meant that the specialized detectives from Scotland Yard were tasked with starting from the very beginning, re-examining every witness statement, every forensic report, and every tip-off as if they were seeing it for the first time. The objective was to identify investigative opportunities that had been missed during the chaotic early stages and the subsequent focus on the family. This decision marked a significant shift in the narrative, moving the case from a cold file to an active, state-funded forensic operation. The scale of Operation Grange was massive. The task force was composed of dozens of detectives and civilian analysts who began the arduous task of translating and digitizing tens of thousands of documents from the Portuguese files. This bureaucratic excavation revealed a critical flaw in the original investigation: the fragmentation of information. Because the inquiry had spanned multiple jurisdictions and involved various private agencies, vital pieces of intelligence had never been collated into a single database. From an analytical perspective, this phase highlighted the value of cold case methodology. By removing the immediate pressure of the media storm that existed in 2007, the British detectives could analyze the data dispassionately. They utilized advanced software to cross-reference mobile phone data, flight manifests, and guest lists from the resort. This methodical approach allowed them to spot inconsistencies in timelines and alibis that had previously been accepted as fact. The review suggested that the accepted version of events, specifically the timing of the disappearance, might have been fundamentally flawed. In 2013, 2 years after the review began, Scotland Yard made a public announcement that revitalized the global interest in the case. The lead detective, Andy Redwood, revealed that the team had identified roughly 40 potential suspects or persons of interest who had not been adequately investigated. This list included known offenders who were in the Algarve region at the time, as well as individuals who had been working at or near the Ocean Club. This revelation was a direct challenge to the conclusion reached by the Portuguese authorities in 2008. It implied that the decision to archive the case had been premature and that viable leads still existed. The announcement was accompanied by a televised appeal that featured new computer-generated images of men seen in the area. These efforts were crucial, as they reoriented the public's focus away from the family and back toward the possibility of a stranger intruder. The narrative shifted from "what did the parents do?" to "who are these men?" The progress made by the British team created a complex diplomatic situation. For the British police to act on their new leads, such as arresting suspects or searching properties in Praia da Luz, they required the authorization and cooperation of the Portuguese judicial system. For years, relations between the two forces had been strained, characterized by mutual criticism and differing legal philosophies. However, the weight of the new evidence presented by Scotland Yard was undeniable. In late 2013, the Portuguese authorities officially reopened their investigation, agreeing to run a parallel inquiry alongside Operation Grange. This was a major victory for the family and the British detectives. It signaled a new era of cross-border collaboration, famously described by the authorities as a commitment to leave no stone unturned. The reopening allowed for new letters of request to be issued, granting police the power to interview witnesses again and, crucially, to trace the individuals identified in the new suspect list. As Operation Grange moved forward, it sparked a significant public debate regarding the economics of justice. The cost of the investigation began to climb into the millions of pounds. Critics questioned whether such vast resources should be dedicated to a single case, especially one that had occurred years prior in a foreign jurisdiction. They argued that other missing person cases did not receive a fraction of this funding or attention. Supporters, however, argued that the case represented a unique failure of the system that the state had a moral obligation to rectify. They pointed out that the missing individual was a British citizen who had vanished under suspicious circumstances, and that the initial response had been inadequate. The continued funding was seen as a statement that the passage of time does not diminish the value of a victim. This tension between the financial cost and the moral imperative added another layer of complexity to the investigation, keeping it in the headlines and ensuring that the pressure on the detectives to produce a result remained intense. The reboot was in full effect, but the clock was ticking to turn these expensive new leads into concrete answers. One of the most significant achievements of the operational review conducted by Scotland Yard was the complete dismantling of the established timeline that had governed the investigation for 6 years. Since the early days of the inquiry in 2007, the police had focused heavily on a specific sighting reported by one of the family's friends. This witness had described seeing a man walking away from the Ocean Club apartment complex at approximately 9:15 in the evening, carrying what appeared to be a sleeping individual in his arms. For years, this unidentified male, referred to in the files as the Tannerman, named after the witness, was the prime suspect. The assumption was that the abduction had occurred during the father's check or shortly thereafter. However, the British detectives, utilizing advanced data analysis and re-interviewing witnesses, managed to trace this individual. In a revelation that stunned the investigative community, they identified him not as a perpetrator, but as an innocent British tourist. He had been collecting his own family member from a night activity service at the resort. This confirmation was absolute. The man seen at 9:15 had no connection to the crime. From an analytical standpoint, the misidentification of the Tannerman represents a catastrophic red herring that derailed the investigation for over half a decade. Because the authorities believed this sighting was the kidnapper, they constructed a timeline that required the crime to have happened roughly 45 minutes before the alarm was raised. This focused the search area and the estimated escape route on a specific time window that was, in reality, irrelevant. By eliminating this sighting from the criminal inquiry, the detectives effectively erased the early abduction theory. This was a crucial development because it removed the rigidity of the 9:15 timeline. It meant that the window of opportunity for the perpetrator was not necessarily open during the father's check, but likely occurred later in the evening. The collapse of the Tannerman lead forced the investigators to look for other sightings that had been previously dismissed or overshadowed by this primary, erroneous lead. With the early sighting discarded, the focus of Operation Grange shifted dramatically to a different witness account that had been buried in the files. This sighting was provided by a family from Ireland who had been vacationing in Praia da Luz at the same time. They reported seeing a man walking down a street near the Ocean Club at approximately 10 o'clock in the evening, the exact moment the mother discovered the eldest daughter was missing. This individual, later referred to as the Smithman, was described as carrying a young family member in an uncomfortable or awkward manner, heading away from the apartment area and toward the beach and the ocean. Unlike the innocent tourist identified earlier, the Smithman has never been traced or identified. The description provided by the witnesses did not match the innocent tourist. This man was described as having a different build and hair color. The realignment of the timeline to 10 o'clock placed this man at the center of the inquiry, making him the new primary person of interest. The shift to the Smithman timeline had profound implications for the status of the parents. If the abduction occurred at 10 o'clock, it coincided almost perfectly with the mother's discovery. This timing supported the theory of a disturbance abduction, where the perpetrator was interrupted by the mother entering the room, or had fled mere moments before. Crucially, this timeline heavily reinforced the innocence of the parents, as they were verified to be at the dinner table or conducting checks during the minutes leading up to 10 o'clock. Investigative analysts argue that this reconstruction was the most vital contribution of the British Review. It moved the narrative away from the complex and unsubstantiated theories involving the family and grounded it back in the data of external sightings. The release of 2 computer-generated images, EFITs, of this new suspect in 2013 reinvigorated the public appeal. It presented a specific face to the world, a man of medium build, short hair, and approximately 30 to 40 years of age, who had been ignored for years because he did not fit the earlier flawed timeline. Despite the clarity brought by the timeline reconstruction, the Smithman lead presented its own set of challenges. By the time this individual became the priority focus in 2013, 6 years had passed. The trail had gone cold. The opportunity to secure CCTV footage from the route leading to the beach or to canvass the area for forensic traces that might have been left by a man walking toward the ocean had long since evaporated. The reconstruction serves as a stark lesson in the fragility of witness testimony. The investigation had prioritized one sighting over another, based on the proximity of the witness to the family rather than the intrinsic value of the evidence. By the time the error was corrected, the Smith man had essentially walked into the darkness of history. However, this forensic pivot established the current working theory that the disappearance was a stranger abduction that occurred late in the hour, executed by an individual who utilized the cover of darkness to move toward the coastline, unnoticed by the chaotic search that was just beginning to form behind him. In June of 2020, the trajectory of the investigation shifted fundamentally once again. After years of pursuing leads that often ended in frustration, the German authorities, working in conjunction with British and Portuguese officials, made a startling announcement. They revealed that a new prime suspect had been identified. This individual, referred to in reports as a German national, was not a transient tourist, but a man who had been residing in the Algarve region for extended periods during the critical time frame. This development marked the most significant breakthrough since the inception of the case. Unlike previous persons of interest who were often identified based on subjective sketches or circumstantial proximity, this suspect was flagged based on concrete intelligence sharing between nations. The suspect, who was 43 years old at the time of the announcement, was already incarcerated in Germany for matters unrelated to this inquiry. This fact provided the authorities with a unique advantage. They knew exactly where he was, allowing them to build their case without the immediate risk of flight. Analysts reviewing the background of this individual noted a pattern of behavior that aligned disturbingly well with the profile of an opportunistic predator. He was described as living a transient lifestyle, often dwelling in a camper van or temporary accommodation, which allowed him to move beneath the radar of local registration systems. Records indicated that he had been staying at the Ocean Club Resort, or in its immediate vicinity, during the exact window when the British family was present. The significance of this geographical overlap cannot be overstated. For the first time, investigators had a suspect with a verified history of criminal activity, who was physically positioned at the scene of the disappearance. His criminal history, which began when he was 15, included convictions for theft and unauthorized entry, painting a picture of an individual who was comfortable violating boundaries and operating in the shadows. This profile offered a plausible explanation for how an intruder could have entered the apartment without forcing the shutters. Experience in burglary and stealth. With the identification of this suspect, the classification of the case by German prosecutors took a grim turn. While the British police continued to treat the matter as a missing person inquiry, implying the possibility of survival, the German investigators publicly stated that they were investigating a murder. This divergence in perspective was stark. The German officials based their assessment on concrete evidence suggesting the victim was no longer alive, although they stopped short of revealing the specific nature of this evidence to the public to protect the ongoing inquiry. This announcement was a devastating blow to the hope that had sustained the parents for over a decade. However, it also brought a renewed sense of focus. The investigation was no longer chasing ghosts or Tannerman. It was focused on a specific, tangible individual with a name and a face who was already within the grip of the justice system. In modern forensic investigations, digital data often speaks louder than physical witnesses. The case against the German suspect was bolstered significantly by the analysis of telecommunication records. Investigators were able to isolate a mobile phone number attributed to the suspect and trace its movements through the cellular network towers in Praia da Luz on the night of May 3, 2007. The data revealed a handshake between the suspect's device and the cell tower serving the Ocean Club area. This evidence placed him geographically within the immediate zone of the disappearance during the critical window. It was a technological confirmation of presence that no alibi could easily refute. The records indicated that the device received a phone call at a specific time in the evening, roughly 1 hour before the alarm was raised, and the connection lasted for approximately 30 minutes. Investigative analysts focus heavily on this 30-minute window. Who was on the other end of the line? Was the suspect conducting surveillance? Was he coordinating with an accomplice, or was it a mundane conversation that merely happened to place him at the scene? The identity of the second caller remains one of the key outstanding questions of the investigation. Authorities have appealed directly to the public for information regarding this number, believing that the person on the other end of that conversation holds the final piece of the puzzle. Beyond the digital evidence, the investigation also uncovered anomalies regarding the suspect's assets. Records showed that he possessed a camper van and a distinct luxury sedan during his time in Portugal. Of particular interest to the detectives was the administrative history of the sedan. The vehicle was re-registered into another person's name on the day immediately following the disappearance. Behavioral experts argue that the rapid disposal or transfer of assets immediately following a major crime is a classic distancing tactic. It suggests a desire to break the link between the individual and a potential piece of physical evidence. This bureaucratic action, executed so swiftly after the event, adds a layer of circumstantial weight to the theory that the suspect was cleaning his tracks before the police investigation could fully mobilize. While forensic evidence builds the structure of a case, it is often human testimony that provides the narrative. In the year 2017, a pivotal tip-off reached the authorities that would eventually lead them to the German suspect. A witness, who had known the suspect during his time in Portugal, came forward with information regarding a conversation that had taken place years prior. According to reports, the suspect and the witness were socializing when the topic of the missing British daughter appeared on a television news segment. It was the 10th anniversary of the disappearance, and the case was once again in the headlines. The witness alleged that, upon seeing the report, the suspect made a comment claiming he was responsible for the disappearance. This alleged confession was the catalyst that turned a cold lead into an active pursuit. The specific wording of the alleged confession has been the subject of intense scrutiny. The witness claimed the suspect indicated knowledge of the victim's reaction, or lack thereof, during the event. Reports suggest the suspect implied he had specific knowledge of the victim's reaction during the event, a detail that deeply disturbed the investigators. If true, this statement implies a level of intimacy with the crime that only the perpetrator could possess. It suggests a stealthy extraction where the subject was silenced or removed before they could raise an alarm. Legal analysts caution that confessions made to acquaintances, especially those influenced by alcohol or social settings, are difficult to prosecute. The defense can argue that the comments were bravado, dark humor, or misinterpreted. However, in this instance, the witness statement aligned with the geographical and technical data that investigators were independently uncovering. The suspect, communicating through his legal defense from prison, has vehemently denied these accusations. In a letter written from his cell in 2021, he labeled the investigation a scandal and demanded the resignation of the prosecutors, maintaining his innocence. This creates a classic standoff. The word of an accuser against the denial of the accused, with the authorities caught in the middle, trying to find the physical proof that will tip the scales. With the German suspect firmly in their sights, investigators began to re-examine the physical locations associated with his life in Portugal. This led to renewed search operations, the most prominent of which involved the excavation of land near his former residence. The police, acting on intelligence that the suspect may have hidden evidence, utilized heavy machinery and ground-penetrating radar to scour the earth. One significant area of interest was a location described as a hidden cellar or a structural void beneath a property where the suspect had lived. The existence of such a concealed space fits the profile of an individual who values hiding places. The discovery of this cellar raised the possibility that it may have been used to store illegal materials or, in the worst-case scenario, to conceal significant evidence related to the disappearance. The search efforts also extended to the Arade Dam Reservoir, a remote location inland from the coast. Intelligence suggested that the suspect referred to this area as his little paradise, a place he frequented for solitude. In recent years, international teams have conducted extensive searches of the reservoir banks and the water itself, looking for non-perishable items, clothing, jewelry, or fragments that might have been discarded there. These searches were conducted under the intense glare of the world's media. While investigators removed several bags of material for analysis, no definitive announcement has been made linking these items to the missing individual. This silence from the laboratory is agonizing for the family. It leaves the case in a state of suspended animation. The physical search demonstrates the commitment of the authorities to follow the German lead to its conclusion, but it also highlights the immense difficulty of finding forensic traces after so many years of exposure to the elements. As the calendar marked the 15th anniversary of the disappearance, the case of the missing daughter from the Ocean Club solidified its status as the most perplexing mystery of the 21st century. What began as a holiday nightmare has evolved into a generational saga of loss, accusation, and the relentless pursuit of truth. The sheer duration of the inquiry, spanning nearly 2 decades, has seen children grow into adults, officers retire, and governments change. Yet the central question remains unanswered. Where is she? The financial cost of the investigation has reached into the millions, a figure that sparks debate, but ultimately underscores the unique nature of this case. It is a testament to the power of a parent's love and the refusal of a society to let a young individual vanish without explanation. Today, the case exists in 2 parallel realities. In one, maintained by the German prosecutors, the case is a solved murder awaiting the final piece of evidence to bring it to trial. They are certain of their suspect and certain of the tragic outcome. In the other reality, maintained by the family and their supporters, there is still hope. Without a body, there is no proof of death. The parents continue to mark birthdays and anniversaries, holding on to the possibility, however slim, that the missing individual is still out there, unaware of her own history. The disappearance at Praia da Luz serves as a somber mirror to our own fears. It reminds us of the fragility of safety and how quickly a life can be altered in the silence of a few unsupervised minutes. Whether the German suspect is eventually charged, or whether the mystery deepens, the image of the young daughter with the distinctive eye defect has become an indelible icon. She is the daughter of the world, and until the final truth is written, the story cannot end. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of the most complex investigations of our time. This story is a reminder that behind every headline and every file number, there are human lives waiting for answers. We will continue to monitor the developments in this case as the legal processes in Germany unfold. If you found this analysis valuable, please consider supporting our channel so we can continue to bring you these in-depth reports. Stay safe, stay observant, and we will see you in the next video.